All right, let's go ahead and get started. So good afternoon or good morning, everyone. My name is Noelle Hicks, and I'm with Roberts Markel Weinberg Butler Haley. I am a shareholder in our Houston office. And today, along with Andrew Stoutenburg from Reserve Advisors, we're going to be talking about reserve studies and their importance to POAs. Andrew, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. I'll echo Noelle. Thanks everyone for attending, taking time out of your day. Andrew Stoutenburg with Reserve Advisors, based over here in Austin, but we're throughout the great state of Texas. Happy to be here and chatting with you all about reserve studies.
Awesome, thank you. So today we're going to cover quite a bit of information about reserve studies. As we mentioned, we're going to get into some really important things that I think will probably help all of us in our day-to-day practices. So Kyle, if you could go to our disclaimer. As you guys know, if you've been here with us before, we always like to give this disclaimer that the information that we're presenting to you today is the law as it exists as of April 16th, 2024. It's not legal advice. We're just doing this for educational purposes. But if you have any questions about what we talk about today, go ahead and reach out to your attorney, reach out to Andrew. We'll provide our contact information at the end of today's presentation so you guys can get in touch with us. So our agenda for today is going to be as follows. We are going to talk about what a reserve study is, really define that for us so that everybody can get a good grasp of what it is, why we need it, what are the different funding methodologies, and as community managers or even board members, what part do we play in the reserve study process? And then finally, what does the Property Owners Association do once it has obtained a reserve study or once it's completed? And how can it use that to kind of better manage the POA? So let's just jump into it. POAs have been really highly scrutinized over the past several years, especially after the collapse of Champlain Towers in 2021. We've seen more of an interest in the financial state of POAs from state legislators, the media, loan providers like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And actually, for example, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are now requesting more information on the amount of deferred maintenance that's been accrued by a POA. So what can a POA do to kind of meet this scrutiny head on? Well, it can request a reserve studies, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So what is a reserve study? Well, actually, in order for us to get a better understanding of what it is, we can probably discuss better what it is not first. So a reserve study is not just an evaluation of the integrity of components of the association. It's not just a thorough examination of maybe the wiring or utility lines or other pipes and things of that nature that are found in the walls maintained by the association. And that's probably more dealing with like a condominium building. And it's not just all about the future of the POA or just something to improve the POA's financial outlook. Instead, what it really is, and Kyle, you can go to the next slide, is a combination of all the things that I just mentioned. And to really put a nice little bow on it, a reserve study is a comprehensive analysis of the life expectancy of major components owned by the POA. So it's generally comprised of two parts. There's a physical evaluation of the community and then a financial analysis. And if we're speaking about a single family property owners association, this can include things like the recreation center, clubhouse, pool, and even when we're talking about things like signage, lighting components, or private roads. So essentially all of the things that the POA owns and is responsible for maintaining. If we're talking about condominium buildings or even like a complex, then it's the structure of the building, the mechanical systems within that building, possibly roads and other common elements like a pool, a gym, parking lot, or even the parking garage. So those are just kind of some things to keep in mind when we're talking about the different communities here. Now, the actual purpose of a reserve study is to estimate the cost of future repairs and replacement of certain components, some of the components that I just mentioned. In addition, a reserve study can serve as a budgeting tool or a planning tool to assist the POA in managing their cash reserves for any non-annual expected predictable expenses. So this is really something that can help the association really plan for the future and make sure that it is well equipped for anything that comes up. Let's move on to the next slide. So I mentioned that the reserve study can serve as a budgeting tool, and we'll get into the details of that a little bit later. Andrew's going to dive into that a little bit later in the presentation. But if we think about this logically, of course, we can see that this sort of in-depth evaluation can assist the association with future budgeting, right? Having an idea of whatever known or predictable future expenditures the association might have can really help the association to manage their cash reserves. And there's a three-part test for what is expected and a predictable expense. Andrew, do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, so that comes from the reserve study standards. Very captivating document that anyone can read. It's produced by CAI, and so it's where it outlines for any expense to be included in the reserve expenditure plan, which is also the capital expenditure plan, or CapEx. All those mean the same thing. The listing of these major projects, we always want to ensure that expense passes what they call the three-part test. So step one, which I don't have on the screen, but it has to be an association element, right? Because that's what this is for. And then the next two, it has to be reasonably anticipated, meaning when this project is going to occur, as well as we have to be able to reasonably estimate the cost of it, that we can say we're pretty relatively confident it's going to cost $10,000. And based on its condition, it should be spent or expended in 4 years from now. If we can't, sort of meet those three criteria, we're not going to see that expense captured in a reserve study. And we'll sort of talk about it a little later too as well.
Awesome, thank you. So again, a budgeting planning function, as one of those, the reserve study can really serve as a really important tool. It analyzes the association's cash reserves, as I mentioned, and it kind of puts the association in one of three categories: baseline, threshold, or fully funded, which we will talk about a little bit later. So we need to kind of get into the legal requirements. Obviously, as the attorney, I want to make sure that we all know what the legal requirements are. Some people may think that a reserve study is required by law, but here in the state of Texas, it is not. It is not a requirement that the association have a reserve study. Perhaps it should be. I think it would be a good idea to have a reserve study requirement. And I'm sure Andrew would echo that sentiment. But it's something that would definitely help associations if it was a requirement. Not just financially, but also structurally, right? Because it can serve to highlight different levels of funding for associations to maintain its assets. And some of those assets that I mentioned before, like recreation centers or pools, and that can kind of go both with single family or condominium associations. It also can really help the association to anticipate its future needs. And this could be particularly important with aging condominium buildings to address things like electrical upgrades or future structural issues. Now, this is something that, the legislative has tried to incorporate in prior sessions. We have not quite gotten there yet. Again, Texas does not have a requirement. There are other states that do have the requirement. So if we go to our next slide, we can see what that looks like. And Andrew, I don't know if you wanted to chime in here, but this is a graphic that Andrew provided for us to kind of show where the states are with their state requirements.
Yeah, I think really the main thing I can add here is as Noelle said, there's nothing in current Texas statutes requiring it. There obviously are plenty of states that are, and really what's important to be aware of is the growing rate of states creating laws that require reserve studies and or funding in some capacity. So we're really seeing it accelerate. Again, hasn't happened yet. We meet every other year, so it's it can take a little bit longer to finally get a law, but we expect at some point we'll see some level of legislation just because where sort of the industry is moving. But right now there is no requirement in the state of Texas.
And like I mentioned, it's probably it would probably be a good thing if there was a requirement. And like Andrew mentioned, we're moving towards that. Of course, we do have some statutory guidance for reserves, but there's just no law in place at this time. So moving on, right? Thank you. So why should the association consider doing a reserve study? Well, there's a couple of reasons, and it's really fundamental to having a good understanding of the association's future needs, as I mentioned. It will assist the association in establishing a funding plan, which we've talked about, to address future financial things that might come up. And if we define that kind of thing early on, it will really help the association with its management, governance, and so on and so forth. And there are a lot of benefits that we can see about that. And one of those is obviously to determine if the association has adequate levels of funding. And it kind of goes hand in hand with making sure that we're minimizing risk of special assessments because, as you all probably know, getting a special assessment approved is a pretty big undertaking. So if the association needs additional funding, that's usually the first line of defense is trying to get a special assessment approved. It's difficult to get the buy-in from the community on those sorts of things. And then a lot of times, there are certain thresholds that the governing documents will require to even implement a special assessment. And then it's really hard to convince homeowners sometimes that a special assessment is required, especially if they don't have the information that they need in order to kind of justify that special assessment. So if we consider, having a reserve study, it kind of minimizes the risk of us having to go through that process. It's hard to find funding for POAs right now in general. And so obviously the first thing we would look to do is creating that special assessment. And we want to avoid that if we possibly can. It also helps to define how much money that the association needs in their reserve accounts, assist them in, of course, establishing that funding plan if there are future financial needs of the association. And one of the big things too is making sure that all of owners are paying their fair share. This is kind of a pervasive with POAs, right? So with when it comes to, making sure that the association is properly maintained. And even when you go so far as, if the association has to expend funds on attorney's fees and things like that, one of the main arguments that we like to kind of present to the community is we want to ensure that all owners are paying their fair share. And it's really not necessarily fair if, owners are having to pay more than they should. So, one of the main things that the board has to consider is this, fair share is kind of really important. And then honestly, it really just makes sense to understand the future needs of the association. If what sort of maintenance items might be coming up in the future and how much money you might need in order to take care of those, that really helps the association to just kind of run more smoothly and helps to get, that buy-in from the community because you're being transparent, you're having that communication and making sure that everyone knows what's going on.
If I can add a few points on this, because there's some really good aspects. So I'll go backwards real quickly, but on the fair share, that's a critical aspect of reserves, right? Because what unfortunately we'll hear is, why am I putting money away for some owner's roof 20 years into the future? Like if you're a condo or fill in the blank, whatever asset it is. And this concept of fair share is we have to understand reserves. We're in essence paying for our current use of that asset, right? So meaning that roof kept us dry, it kept us warm or cool, depending on the season, right? We used up some portion of its life. And in essence, that's what we're reserving away so that, yes, in 20 years, when it needs to be replaced, all the funds are there. And that continues on in perpetuity. So we're always accumulating the funds. So that's a really, really important concept when we say fair share. And then also the third bullet point in there, defining how much money is needed. And that can mean a lot of things. Something that's intriguing that I've found over the years of doing this is there are plenty of associations that are relatively properly funded, which is outstanding. And when you're well funded or somewhat adequately funded, that means some years of your community's life, you may have a lot of money in the reserve account. And it is very interesting, the dynamic that can start to occur when you have a lot of money, especially if you're not spending it in the next year. Then we want to stop contributing, or we maybe want to use it for projects that it's not intended to be used for. And that is a really critical part of a reserve study, because I think I have a chart later that'll sort of showcase this. But that money's there for a very intentional reason. Quite frankly, we're usually sitting on a lot of money leading up to some years of big expenses. And so seeing all that tie together, it's really, really important for a board, because you will get those questions. Why do we have $500,000 in the bank and you haven't put a new playground in yet? The reserve study is going to say, well, because we need that money because we're repaving our roads in 4 years. And guess what? Playground is anticipated to be replaced in 2 years, whatever it may be. So really important aspects I just wanted to chime in on there.
Yeah, and I agree with that too, Andrew. And then I would also say, of course, there are some communities who, like you mentioned, they are well funded, they are able to do things like put their money aside in a CD or something, for example, so that it can accumulate more money so they have the funding for future needs. But then these are considerations for a lot of communities, the majority of communities that are underfunded and don't have the money. So it's important for us to kind of explain now why reserve studies are so important, so that people can understand, even if you don't necessarily have the funding, you still need to try and have this done, have this completed, so that you can kind of set up the association for the future. All right, let's move on. So we need to, of course, again, we want to talk about the legal aspect of this and why it's so important. And so there is a responsibility on the board of directors of an association to make sure that they are, setting up the association for the future. And because there's no law in Texas to conduct routine reserve studies, that responsibility generally falls onto the board. They have to ensure that these reserve studies are actually done so that, the association kind of knows where it falls, where it is. As board members, there is a standard of care to maintaining long-term sound financial accounts for the association, and that can vary based on what type of association we're dealing with. In most cases, in condo associations, the board will have a fiduciary duty to maintain this long-term sound financial status for the association. When we're dealing with single family property owners associations, though, the board could possibly risk violating its standard of ordinary care. So those two standards of care are a little bit different. To determine the standard of care for the community, whether it's ordinary care or it's a fiduciary duty, you want to make sure that the board consults its legal counsel and looks into the governing documents to figure out what that standard of care is. A lot of people are under the misconception that the standard of care across the board for community associations is fiduciary duty, and that's not necessarily the case. A fiduciary duty is only created by the governing documents. Otherwise, it's generally just an ordinary standard of care. So, that's important for us to kind of keep in mind too. And we've talked about that in previous webinars, what the board standard of care is. But, considering if the board fails to take action on, certain things that come up in the reserve study or even obtaining a reserve study, especially if it's been advocated by an industry specialist like a CPA, like Andrew, or like the board's attorney like me, many boards may risk losing their volunteer immunity. And they also might risk losing their protection that's afforded to them by the association's D&O insurance coverage. Another thing too is that a lack of a strong reserve and deferred maintenance schedule really brings challenges that could have devastating effects on the property value in the POA. And honestly, one of the main reasons why people buy into a property owners association is to maintain that property value. When I go to court and argue, that the community is trying to enforce a deed restriction violation, one of the things that I always mention to judges is to keep in mind that the community and the neighbors want to make sure that their property values stay very high. So reserve studies are a part of maintaining that, right? And then this could also, failure to kind of take these steps could result in questions on whether the board is meeting that standard of care that we just talked about. And it could expose the board or the association to potential litigation. So if the association has questions, in the future on the reserve study process, what a reserve study should look like for their specific association, then it should definitely look to its management team. It should contact Andrew. It could reach out to their attorney, me, to ask questions to help them kind of navigate the process and to use whatever tools are available to them to make sure that the association can benefit from like long-term financial health, because that will help not only the association itself, but also its members. So we are going to now get into the funding aspect, different levels and some misconceptions, misunderstandings about funding, and Andrew's going to take over from here.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Something interesting that was on the prior slide is that concept of losing volunteer immunity if specialists advise action and none's taken. And that really sort of dovetails into this challenge that I've heard over the years of, and these are real conversations I've had where a board says, we want a reserve study. We know we need to totally change. We're severely underfunded, but we're scared to get it and see the results and then have to go follow it, right? And it's interesting, and this is where having a lawyer on the call is certainly going to be helpful because, well, there's no statutory requirement to fund it, but there is this sort of challenge of, well, you have a third party advisor or professional saying you should do something, and maybe you as a board are saying there's no way we could fund it, or it's we're going to get voted off the board, or there's going to be a recall. So I recognize that can be a challenge, and it's not easy to solve. That being said, something I always point out, and we have a little image on the screen here, is your property doesn't care. Okay. Your roof of your clubhouse doesn't go, you know what? I haven't been maintained well over the years, and this board's sort of in a tight spot. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to last 5 more years for them. Right. That's not a reality we live in. And so while yes, it may be challenging, what the reserve study recommends or the guidance it provides, it's a factual statement of here are your assets, here's where they are in their lifespan, and here's what you need to do from a funding level to be able to maintain these. Ignoring it doesn't make this problem go away. So I always like to bring that up again, not to make light of it. I completely understand and empathize with the challenge of, hey, we may be severely underfunded. How do we get out of this? Well, the reserve study gives you that path, and we're going to help sort of outline how you can hopefully over time get from an underfunded scenario to an adequate funded scenario. So again, some other points on the screen, but that's the main point I always like to make there. So let's actually get into funding levels. So we'll talk about each of these. And if you've ever researched or had a reserve study or listened to any webinar, you've likely heard some of these phrases. So when we talk about funding, and we're going to unpack all these, don't worry, but there's a few concepts or methodologies. There's something that we would call full funding. Then let's go to the other extreme, which would be baseline funding. And then really anywhere between those two is generally what we would call threshold funding. But likely many people have heard the term percent funded, or you've heard, hey, we need to be 70% funded or X% funded. That all of those are in between the two ends of the spectrum of full to baseline. So any of that is in essence this concept of threshold funding. So we're going to walk through all of these. Before we do, on the next slide, there's a really nice definition. I don't know how many people can get excited about definitions, but I appreciate this because I actually sort of fall back on this very regularly when I'm talking about reserve studies in this application, or I or one of our engineers have issued a study and we're chatting with the board after the fact to sort of help you on that journey. And so, I'm not big on reading the words on the slide. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I am going to sort of touch on this. So first of all, this comes from, I mentioned the reserve study standards earlier, which is a great document to read. This is a companion document, which is an explanation of reserve study standards. Smart, because you normally need to explain standards because they can be cumbersome at times. And it really simply defines this concept of adequate replacement reserves. Now you'll notice that does not say full threshold, but it is just helping us define what is adequate, which is sort of a vague term, and I like and appreciate its vagueness. And so it's defining what this means is it's when you have your replacement reserve fund or your reserves, the dollars, and a stable, equitable funding plan. Okay, so it's having money in the bank when you have the right amount of money in the bank, and you have a funding plan where your annual contributions, right, that one part of your budget, is a relatively stable, equitable year contribution. When you have those two together, and they are now allowing you as a board or as a community to have timely execution of major repair and replacement without relying on supplemental funding. And they use that because technically, you could do a special assessment or you could do a loan. It's supplemental funding. So I know that's sort of a mouthful, but like when we take a step back and we think about one of your goals as a board, when you get a reserve study, why did we get it? We're going to talk about even more of it. But really, when we zoom way out, we get a reserve study to give us guidance on this concept. We want to make sure as a board we can timely execute the projects that we need to, because ignoring them doesn't change it. And we can do that with a healthy reserve balance and relatively equitable or fair share contributions going in. It's really important that we start here before we get into the minutia, which I'm going to bore you with here in a second, because we always want to pull back and say, we can argue of should we be 70% funded or 100, or should we be baseline? But we want to say, what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve this timely execution of projects on a equitable or a fair share collection basis. Okay, so just always keep that in the back of our mind. So when we think about actually developing that funding guidance, if any of you are, or a lot of you are probably on your boards currently, if you go to the next slide, you've looked at your annual budget. Most management companies, it's that very last line item in your budget, and it's called reserve contribution, capital contribution, something like that. That is what we're talking about. That's what the reserve study is giving you guidance on. What annually needs to go in there. So when I produce a reserve study, I first have to outline all of the expenditures, right? Those projects that we can timely execute. Once I've outlined those, I can come up with a multitude of funding recommendations with these different methodologies. So we're going to start with the most conservative one. And so when we say most conservative, that's full funding, which is on the screen, and I'll break it down. And it's conservative in that it's going to minimize your risk of special assessment being needed as most as possible. We can always be surprised, but it's going to do the best job at minimizing that risk. But it's also going to ask for the highest amount of funds to be collected. And so there's a lot of numbers on the screen, but I just want to really simplistically explain this. We'll just take that very first component, this pool furniture. It has a replacement cost of $20,000. Its useful life, the UL, its useful life is 5 years. It's going to last 5 years. All made up numbers. Don't worry about the reality of this. And the remaining life is 0. It's out of life. So we can calculate the fully funded balance. I could show you the equation. It's not that it's that complex, but it's really the value that's been used up. Well, this asset's at end of life. So the fully funded balance would be having all $20,000 in your bank account. And then we'll only look at one more. I'm not going to put everyone to sleep. But on the very next one, the resurfacing of the pool, it has a lifespan of 10 years. Its remaining life is 5. So it's halfway through its life. If the cost to replaster or resurface your pool was $10,000, at half of its life, that fully funded balance is $5,000. It's half of it. So we would run that calculation on all 10, 20, 100, however many components you have. And we would just add those up. And you see it at the bottom of the screen there. For this point in time, the fully funded balance is $680,000 and change for this community, this hypothetical community. The reason I walk you through that math is there's a lot of misconception around this. And if this community wanted to say we are fully funded, that means they're meeting this specific methodology. It's going to be very conservative. They're going to be doing everything to minimize risk of special assessment. For them to say it at this point in time, they would need to have $680,000 in their reserves. That's what fully funded means. It means their reserve balance is equal to this calculated concept of the fully funded balance. And on the next slide, you can see how we just simply relate those. I'm sorry, go one more slide, please. I did these in the wrong order. You can see this dabbles into threshold, but look at this chart. If their reserve fund is $680,000, that's the fully funded balance. They are fully funded or 100% funded. That's what fully funded is. So this chart shows you a whole range, right? Go back one slide. My apologies for the order there, Kyle. But so that's what fully funded is. And again, it's the most conservative. It's going to require you contribute usually the highest amount on an annual basis. It's doing everything to minimize your risk of having to incur a special assessment. Nothing can eliminate that risk, but that's what fully funding does. And I don't have this in the slide deck anywhere here, but we've done studies since 1991. So we've done around 30,000 or so. And when we looked at that entire data set on the POA or the single family home side, I think it's 75% were underfunded. And on the condo side, 87% were underfunded. The reason I bring that up is that means the vast majority of our studies are telling people to increase their reserves. And I've also been telling you to be fully funded is going to require the highest contribution rate. So realistically, it's usually not the recommendation that we're going to provide. But again, it's most conservative. It's a way that we can recommend funding. Now, if you continue forward, we'll see the chart that I showed you briefly. But what's important here is, and I said it earlier, this concept of threshold funding or being at some percent funded level is just anywhere below fully funded. 99% is technically a threshold. You're not fully funded. 90%, 50%, 5% is percent funded. It's a really low percent or it's a low threshold, but it's anywhere below that. That's what threshold funding is. Now, if you go to the next slide, there's a chart that I've been accused of getting in every single presentation I've ever given, and it's a true accusation because I think it tells a lot of stories. So this is in our executive summaries. And just to explain what's going on and then unpack it, this shows this association's 30-year window. The green bars are those relatively stable, equitable contributions going into their reserves. The red bars are those expenditures, the timely execution of expenditures. And the blue line is the reserve balance. And so what I want you to notice on this is, first on the green bars, they do grow over time. That's inflationary. So, that in essence neutralizes it. So that's how we're meeting that relatively stable, equitable. And that blue line has peaks and troughs. I sort of teed this up earlier, but there are periods of times with lots of money in the bank. And then that's usually followed by spending most of that down to a really low level. And on the next page, I didn't overlay it on, but on the next slide, you'll see, and not that you would memorize that prior image, but look on this far right column. These are the numbers from that chart. So there's years where their percent funded level is, I wouldn't call it high, but it's 20, it's in the teens, it's 20%. But there's also years that it's really low, right after we've gotten through our major CapEx. All of this is in this world of threshold funding or percent funding. It's instead of seeking this fully funded balance, which I've already said many times is very conservative, the threshold analysis allows us, and I have it on the screen, the simplest way to describe it is the right cash at the right time, right? We have plenty of cash before major projects and not that much cash after. So you read between the lines, our percent funded level before is somewhat elevated, but after major project, it's really low. So that's the beauty in threshold. You can argue it's more risky of special assessment, but to be very clear, I said we've been doing it 30 years. We recommend threshold funding, and we don't have clients coming back year over year saying, oh, darn it, we ran into this huge special assessment. So it usually strikes that balance. And then finally, I believe on the next slide is just a quick, it sort of articulates everything I said. We don't need to read that. I think I got the point across. If you go to the next slide, we finally get to baseline. And this is just, take that threshold till you, in essence, have $0 in certain years. That's as low as you can go because we're not going to recommend you run out of money or go negative. And think of it as a continuum. At this point, in certain years, you're going to run into a higher risk of special assessment. Okay, so zooming back on that, it's a lot of numbers. It's honestly a lot to cover. The main reason I like to sort of go through that is one, if you're looking up anything on reserve studies, you'll come across we need to be 70% funded. I don't think that really tells you the whole story. That's one goal to have, but really you can always provide multiple funding recommendations, and that's why I started with that concept of adequate reserves. It's that balance of, can we timely execute the projects, and are we collecting assessments that are relatively fair to everyone, and do we have a healthy enough reserve balance? That's the goal. That's really what we're wanting to achieve. So we can achieve that in multiple ways. So those are our funding methodologies. We can talk about those, at the end if we have time, or even offline. If there are some more detailed or nuanced questions, happy to chat about those. So
Real quick,
moving
Andrew, don't you
beyond,
think that
yes, go
this
ahead.
kind of becomes an issue, especially here in Houston, where we experience so many natural disasters? There's a couple of points in the graphics that you showed where the community could have a lot of funding, and then they, get down to a point where there's not that much because they've had to expend some funds on repairing something that, hurricane, whatever has messed up. What's your recommendation for that, or how often do you see that kind of thing?
And so to clarify, so we have maybe a natural disaster or something not planned.
Right.
We have to put all new roofs in, we deplete our funds. And is the question like, how do we, no pun intended, weather that storm? Or like,
Yes.
what do we do next? Is that sort of where the question is?
Yes.
So, um, first thing to start with is a reserve study is for the anticipated end of life. So certainly when when your roof should last 20 years, and in year 5, you have something happen and you have to replace them. Well, one, insurance covers some of that, sometimes all of it, but many associations end up having to spend from reserves. I actually have a client right now I'm dealing with. They had a hailstorm. They have insurance, but it doesn't cover the whole cost, and they've spent every penny in their reserve fund. So you do what needs to be done to maintain the association. So I'm just going to stick with roofs. You need new roofs. You spend whatever insurance proceeds you can. You expend your reserves up to all of them because they are there for roofs, among other things. And if that's still not enough, maybe you do have to take out a loan or a special assessment. Once enough of that dust has settled and you sort of understand where you're going to be financially, absolutely you're going to have to update that study, because not only have life expectancies and age of and date of service changed, but also what's in that reserve fund. So when those, I'll call them catastrophic or significant events occur that radically change life's replacement times and fund and balances, yeah, the study is instantly totally off base, because reality will always diverge from the plan, but that's caused it to take a hard left turn. You're going to have to redo the study and find new, and it may be now you have a number of years of significant assessments because that's sort of the hand you were dealt.
Yeah. Okay.
So next slide, beyond baseline funding. So getting into again, less of the boring numbers, but what part do you play, right? As a board member, what is important? So Noelle mentioned it earlier, right at the beginning. There's 2 parts to a reserve study. There's a physical evaluation and then financial analysis. So sort of diving into financial analysis. Not a lot's really needed on your part, but on that physical evaluation, that is where, as a board member, there's some ways that you can influence that, and also just things to be aware of. Okay. And first thing, we talked about it at the very beginning as well, the 3-part test. So when a reserve specialist is putting together a reserve study, we're going to look at all your common elements. We're going to figure out when they need to be replaced and for what cost. But a very important aspect of that is we need to know what are your common elements. And I'm always very clear, I'm no expert in that. I'm an expert in replacement cost and timing, but I don't walk into a property and magically know what is and isn't yours, right? So it's a very, very critical part that you as a board and your management team, if you're professionally managed, you play a huge part there when you sit down with that reserve specialist at the onset of a reserve study engagement. And I think Noelle has a client that sort of ran into some issues there that she could share on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did just recently have a client who did have a reserve study conducted. And once the reserve study was conducted, it was then published to the community, which I'll get your opinion on that in just a minute, Andrew. But some concerns were raised because it seemed as though the scope of responsibility was kind of miscommunicated. There were a lot of aspects of the community that were not necessarily the responsibility or not necessarily owned by the POA that were included in the reserve study. So the result was that it appeared as though the association was underfunded because, it put responsibility to, repair fences in the future that didn't belong to the association. And so once that was then published to the community, then, homeowners got a hold of the reserve study, and then they had a lot of questions and they were upset because they heard the word underfunded. And so that's the reason why the scope of responsibility is really important. And then Andrew, give us your opinion on publishing the reserve study results to the community.
Yep. So it's a board's decision, right? It's you're in control of that association. You can do what you want. I am a huge proponent of transparency. So definitely some amount of information being published out there for your entire membership. But transparency without clear communication or education is, I think, where we have seen boards and communities run into challenges. So putting a whole 50, 60, 70 page report out there, to be entirely honest, most homeowners aren't going to read it. The 1% who may be a thorn in your side are going to read no matter what you put out there. But if you're really wanting engagement and your membership to know what's going on, what we're doing as a board, how we're protecting most of our biggest investment, our homes, I think less can be more. So that's where, the executive summary, maybe that chart, maybe the 5-year plan, key pieces of a reserve study being shared can be usually more impactful. But regardless if you share snippets or all of it, I think what's really critical is when that's shared, very clear communication from the board and usually with the reserve specialist on that, board meeting or that annual meeting, explaining what the study is and what it isn't. Honestly, I want to say the biggest challenge what we see is a study gets published out there and homeowners think it means everything that's scheduled in that CapEx schedule must occur exactly when it is. So the pool furniture was supposed to be replaced last year and you didn't do it. Well, you as the board no, we reviewed the study and it recommended that, but we went and looked at all the pool furniture and we restrapped 6 of the lounges and realized the rest didn't need to be replaced yet. It's still functioning. All of those things, if you just throw a study out there, it can sort of get used for the wrong purpose by some homeowners. So less can be more, but I love transparency and really clear communication when you publish that.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, what I'm going to end up seeing is that the reserve study has been published and a couple of homeowners are unhappy with the results of it. And they have, taken to social media to, express their opinions, whether they're positive or negative. And that kind of creates a situation in the community, right, that the board then has to take a hold of and figure out how they're going to handle it. So I fully agree with the idea of clear and transparent communication. I love the idea of an executive summary because I agree with you. A lot of the homeowners are not going to fully comprehend the reserve study and what exactly would be necessary, what comes after it, which you'll talk about in a little bit, which might, be, contractors, bids and things of that nature to kind of fix things, understanding the life of things and whether or not stuff actually needs to be, maintained or repaired or if it's good to go for another couple of years. So I do highly recommend that if the board is going to share the reserve study with the community, that be coupled with you, Andrew, or someone, a reserve study specialist that can come in and kind of explain to the community what exactly is being, stated in the summary and what the community needs to kind of look out for in the future. So I agree with that.
Yep. And so I'm notorious for putting too many slides in a slide deck. So I won't talk fast. I'm just going to give you the highlights from the next few slides because there's a few points I do really want to get to. But on this one, scope of responsibility is critical. Right. When you're engaging with a reserve specialist to do the study, this on-site meeting, the other main thing is, I'm just going to speak as if I was the engineer doing it. I want to understand history. What have you done? What haven't you done? What's on your near-term radar? What concerns do you have? Better data in results in a better study. I've done plenty, and as a company, we've done tons of studies where we get very limited information. You can still produce one. It's just the value and the accuracy starts to increase the more data that we're collecting. Quick things to know. It takes about an hour to meet at the beginning of the day. Most reserve study inspections take just 1 day. Again, there's some exceptions, but really the run of the mill, that's sort of what to think about. And I do like to hit on attendance. It's your study. You're paying for it as a board. whatever board members want to be involved or don't want to be involved, it's up to you. Just think about, 15 people at this meeting, probably not going to stay on topic. Sometimes we'll see past board members invited because, hey, Bob was the man or was the president for 10 years and he knows everything. That can be, of course, up to you as the active board, but that can always be potentially helpful. On the next slide, so following that meeting, there's the inspection. There's a lot we could talk about here. I'm going to summarize it in. It's a critical part because the reserve specialist has to evaluate your property, figure out once we know what common elements you have, well, how much fencing do you have? How much site furniture is there? Look at it, condition assess it, figure out its replacement, timeline, and then thinking, more analytically of everything's not just a simple, oh, you have an asset, we need to replace it at end of life. There's different ways to approach projects. And really by that time spent in the field, that's where a qualified reserve specialist can figure that out. For you as a board, there's nothing needed from you aside, make sure we can get into the pool house or the clubhouse or things like that. But the reason you hire someone to do a reserve study is they're an expert in conducting these inspections. What I want to spend, last little bit of time on is really getting into the next 2 or 3 slides. So once I have this reserve study, what do I do as a board member, right? And if we get through the next 3 slides in time, I lay it out as communicate. I've already hit on the concept of communication, contemplate, and collaborate. 3 sort of things to think about as a board member. So on communication, and I start with X at the end of the day, that's the biggest one, okay? At the basic level, it is telling you, the reserve study is telling you what you need to contribute to reserves next year for your budget, right? It's giving you that piece of information. But then as we sort of expand further, especially depending on how involved your residents and homeowners are, it's giving you reasoning behind it. And now you have information to communicate to your membership of, unfortunately, it may be an increase. So we now know what that increase is. It's not a guess, which a lot of communities just guess. It's factually based, but there's reasoning behind it. Well, here's the roadmap of capital projects. Here's what's driving this funding need. Maybe it's an increase or not, but here's what's driving that funding need. Being able to clearly communicate that. And actually, before we even think outward communication, you as a board, if you don't have a study guiding you, you're making these guesses now. You now have this for your own good, right? To make your own decisions. And then also thinking about it's helping you with priorities. I mentioned the unfortunate statistic on the amount of underfunded associations. That means depending on how underfunded they are, prioritization can really come into play. Now, we're going to do everything we can to prioritize critical projects and defer or push out non-critical. And that's an important aspect to be aware of when you're looking at that CapEx schedule. It's helping you see what's taking precedent, what is most important in the near term, because that's going to be the things to focus on as a board and then turn around and communicate out. Also, though, the small stuff matters. And I used the example, I think, of a playground or pool furniture earlier. And I think that's really helpful. Certainly, when you as a board are going through the challenge of saying, hey, our dues are going to go up, and one part of that is the reserve needs are higher than we thought. Not that anyone's going to be happy about that, but the ability for you as a board to say, here's where it's going, here's the assessment of what it's going to, here's why, but you have a game plan for everything. It's not just, well, we need to do it so the roofs can be replaced in 5 years, which is critically important, but you're able to show them that plan and say, but we're also still getting the playground refurbished in 4 years, or that's the plan, and the plan also is that the gym equipment's getting replaced in 3 years. Like, you're still managing all of the assets because you do have a responsibility to do that. You don't just let everything run by the wayside just so you can have new roofs. You're supposed to be able to do all of it. And so seeing that holistic picture, people don't like dues increases, but you can help your membership understand we're still maintaining the overall value of everything that is common at this association. So then on the next slide, when you think about contemplating as a board.
If I can just add to the communicate one, Andrew. So we have to also kind of look at how the most appropriate way to communicate that information to the community would be. It may not be the best idea to do this at a board meeting because, of course, there's time constraints and there's other things to handle at a board meeting. So maybe scheduling town hall meetings and maybe even putting out information in e-blast so the community can be as informed as possible. But that's going to vary according to the community. So, it's just important to figure out how best to make sure that that communication gets out there.
Yeah, I'm absolutely great point, because what works for one community will not work for all. It's not going to necessarily work for the next one, and you know your community's best, and I agree too. I mean, a board meeting can really run out of control. So specific town halls or annuals, great idea there. Um, so then, so that's communicating the plan and the vision. But then you go into the coming months and years. What do you actually do? And this is where you want to take that CapEx schedule and have it help you make decisions. So I sort of already hit on that near term, what's upcoming, what do we need to do? But it is a starting point. It is a directional guidance. It is not every year that my CapEx schedule says to do something, you run out and do that. It starts that decision-making process. So you see what's near term, and then now you start thinking about, well, what do we need to do? If this is the roofs, and there are $1 million of roofs across your whole, townhome community, well, why don't we bring in an expert? Maybe we bring in someone who can do a detailed roof inspection. They're going to get on every single roof. It's going to cost you a little bit of money, but there's a couple benefits. One, they may tell you, you know what, you can actually wait, instead of 3 years that the reserve study was thinking, you can wait 4 or 5. Or maybe it says, we've identified $20,000, $30,000 of repairs that will facilitate the slight deferral of that roof. Now, we got to be careful. There's a lot we could talk about, in this concept of capital repairs to defer replacement. So there's a balance you have to strike. But that type of thinking, it can be very, very helpful, especially if we're in an underfunded scenario. And there are absolutely times where the opposite's occurring, where we need to accelerate projects. And again, that's okay. At the end of the day, you have to maintain your assets. So it's great that I had a plan that I thought the fence would not need to be painted for 7 more years, but for whatever reason, the finish is deteriorating faster and you're going to have to paint it in 4 years. You go do what needs to be done. Of course, you can consult others, but there are going to be times where projects are going to get accelerated, and that is okay, right? You want to look at that roadmap and help you make those informed decisions. And then finally, sort of in this realm of collaborating. So really all of that analysis, thinking about, should we move a project up or defer it or spend money now to kick out life or anything like that, most reserve studies you're receiving now, you have some form of collaborative tool, be it an interactive Excel file or an online version or something where you can sort of use that over the coming few years. Because I didn't mention it earlier, but you have to recognize a reserve study is a point in time. And honestly, by the time it's issued, it's outdated because we inspected it at the beginning of the month and it's issued at the end of the month, and things have slightly changed. And you don't need to update a study every month or even every year, realistically. It's normally a few years till you really need to bring a reserve specialist back on site. So digital tools allow you to sort of massage and move things around and see what happens when your balance is a little lower, or you're not going to exactly meet our funding levels, but you're getting close. Well, you can make those changes and see the impact. All of that, and Noelle sort of hit on this earlier, you want to use professionals to still guide you, right? So this isn't, don't ever use a professional because one, I'd go out of business. So of course I'm not going to say that, but there is merit and value in bringing in the professionals at the right point in time. And again, even other types, as I mentioned, maybe someone who specializes in roofs or building envelopes, or a pavement consultant. If you have millions of dollars of pavement, before you just hire a contractor, there can be some other professionals that can help you. And then I've heard this from others, so I'm sort of stealing the idea, but sometimes the best thing to do with the really vocal homeowner is get them involved. If they're really concerned that you're not maintaining, maybe not a good example, but they're, not maintaining the playground and park area, get them involved. You may say, Andrew, I would never want to have to deal with them regularly, but if they're really passionate about that and they think it's not being managed appropriately, somehow getting them involved sometimes can help, or they realize they don't want to help and they sort of fade off into the distance. So it is helpful, though, to get the right people involved and people who have the time and energy, and they want to, at the end of the day, they probably want to help you manage the association, which again is most of our biggest investments. So, finding ways to leverage them, I think, can be really, really helpful. So we have 5 minutes left, which will not be much at all for Q&A. I have a conclusion slide, but I think probably better, Noelle, if there's anything you want to say, or if there's some questions we want to try to jump right into, let me know. Our contact information will be shared. You can always reach out directly to me. I think my email and phone number should be on it. So in case I don't say it later, I appreciate everyone attending and taking the time out to listen. Noelle, anything you want to say, or do we want to go to questions?
I can just add on to the last thing you said with the homeowners that want to be involved. That's a really good time to create a committee to get them involved. Because like you said, a lot of times maybe they will stay involved and go through the process, but maybe they will realize that they might be in over their heads, and that'll be a good way to kind of get them uninvolved. But we do have a couple of questions. The first thing is, how often are studies required? You kind of touched on that a little bit, but if you could give us a few parameters for that.
Yeah, so recommended every 3 years. And I saw Ken's question in terms of statutory in other states, some are at 3-year intervals, some are at 5. California is actually every 3 years on site, but you in essence have to do a level 3 or off-site update every year in between. So it really runs the gamut. The standards say every 3 years is best practice, and that's what we recommend for when they would be updated.
Okay. I'm going to stick with the questions that are kind of general questions, and the other ones we can address individually. But should the reserve fund be used to fund new projects, or is it meant for existing assets?
It's existing assets. So if you don't have a playground and you want to build a playground, you need to fund that initial development of that through different means. Once it's now a common element, that's when the reserve expenditure schedule or the reserve plan picks it up. So existing assets and infrastructure.
Yeah. And then one other question I see is, explain why reserve study updates are so expensive. It seems about 70% of the cost of a new study and a complete study.
Yep. And I actually really like that question, because the only difference between a full study, which is called a level 1, and an update, which is a level 2, is I don't have to recount everything. That's it. I still come and do re-inspect every asset of your property. Literally everything else. And if you look at the standards, they articulate in a slightly different way, but that's the only difference. So there are some savings, because don't get me wrong, it takes time and energy to quantify your assets, but that's what's different. Otherwise, it's the same process. So that's why, it is lower, but it's not like a quarter of the cost or even half of the cost. I think the gentleman said like 70% ish.
Right.
And it's somewhere around there usually.
What about if a reserve asset exists, but they want to renovate it and make it bigger?
So gray area. I love gray area. So if you have a generic, I'm going to use silly examples, but try to get the point across. If you have a generic little clubhouse and you're like, hey, we're going to go import Italian marble flooring, and that's what we're going to put in, and you have some cheap laminate now, inappropriate. That is not what the reserves are for. But if you have some sort of builder grade laminate floor, and when you renovate the clubhouse, you're putting in a sort of nice wood look tile that, it's definitely nicer, and it's not exactly a replacement in like kind, probably going to be okay. Right. So it's, if your playground, is this big, if you take a picture, and your new one's going to be this big. Okay. If you have a tiny tot lot that's like a slide in a thing, and you're putting in a $500,000 little play park with shade structures and all this jazz, again, that's not a replacement. So it's a spectrum. And then, so your next question is like, well, how do I know when I've teetered too close? It's very hard to define, but that's how I always answer it, is like general replacement, slight expansion is fine. 10 security cameras being replaced with 12 and a key fob, that's okay.
Right.
So that's how I answer that one usually.
Sure. And I think we probably have time for one more. And this one might be a question for me. Can you use a special assessment to collect a reserve study to be done? I think the answer to that question is largely going to depend on what the governing documents say the special assessment should be used for, or what the purpose of a special assessment is. So that's going to be a specific attorney question that you should ask for the community. All of the rest of the questions we're probably not going to have a chance to get to now, but if you guys want to reach out to either me or Andrew, Andrew's contact information is right there on the slide. I can be reached at nhicks@rmwbh.com. Once again, thank you guys so much for joining us today. And Andrew, thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon too. We really appreciate all this really important information that you've given us. You guys have a wonderful day. I will just mention one other thing, that if you have the opportunity, Kyle is going to send out a link for you guys to leave us a review on Google, and just go ahead and leave us 5 stars, guys. You know you want to. Thank you guys so much. We appreciate you guys.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
Bye.